dive. Tonight, we are going to be discussing dolphins, drones, and urine. So I think it will be quite the meandering journey that we've been promised. We are joined this evening by Dr. Jason Bruck. He is an assistant professor at Stephen F. Austin State University. He's also an affiliate faculty member of the Unmanned Systems Research Institute at Oklahoma State University. And with his focuses on dolphin behavior, sensory biology, communication, and conservation technology development, those all keep him very, very busy. So we are very grateful to have him speaking with us tonight. So just a remember to those of you joining live, please submit your questions to the chat. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Bruck.
All righty. Well, thank you all. Thank Dolphin Communication Project for inviting me. I'm just going to get all these fun little controls out of the way. Okay, so I think we have everything set. All right, so thank you all for inviting me. I'm really happy to talk about the work we've been doing over the last few years, kind of highlighting all of the kind of wonderful projects that have been worked on by myself and others and collaborators. So without further ado, let's kind of get into what I do. Basically, my approach is to use ideas of physiology and anatomy, psychology and behavior to study big questions, the evolution of intelligence and communication and the uniqueness of human communication. Basically, I'm really bad at staying in the lines of whatever my discipline's supposed to be. So I consider myself an integrative biologist. That's a nice catch-all for I do a lot of different stuff. I focus on different types of analysis. And so one of the things I want to teach my students at times is what's the difference between an ultimate analysis and approximate analysis. And those are just fancy ways of asking, why did this system evolve? Or why or how does this system work? Kind of the biological machinery of it. And I do both those types of questions. And then lately we've been getting a lot more into questions about conservation as it's become increasingly more important to respect the fact that if we don't act now to conserve many of these animals, they won't be around for us to study all these cool questions about. And so conservation has become a big part of what we do. And so the outline of the talk I'm going to give today focuses on three aspects. One, my initial work on long-term social recognition, identifying the extent of dolphin social memory. Two, the big questions around the nature of dolphins' communication around signature whistles, which are, I'll go into more detail later, but basically those are their whistle names. And then finally, I want to talk to you about some work that I've been doing in collaboration with folks at Oklahoma State University at the Unmanned Systems Research Institute, looking at UAVs, UASs, drones as a mechanism for collecting hormone samples from animals in the wild. And so when I introduce this topic to my students, I'll ask this question: what makes an animal smart? And a lot of times the students will say, oh, you're building buildings, or, math, or some kind of high-minded concept. And I ask, well, okay, those are how you define smart. And there are many animals that can do very similar types of things. But the question here is, what on an evolutionary scale makes an animal smart? And so one of the dominant hypotheses out there is the idea that your social system helps drive your intelligence. And there's even one more hypothesis that goes even one step deeper that argues a specific kind of social system drives your intelligence. And that is an idea called Machiavellian intelligence. Okay, so who's Niccolo Machiavelli? Niccolo Machiavelli came up with this idea that if you're going to be smart, it's because, or if you're going to be successful and do well in the world, it's because you kind of lie, cheat, steal, deceive, kind of win your way through a political minefield. He coined the term might makes right. Okay. And if you look at some chimpanzee societies, you see a lot of that kind of stuff where the chimpanzee that gets the most matings and has the largest social cadre is the one with very few social scruples. It's the male that can show dominance, and it's the females that show how they can manipulate a social environment. And when it comes to trying to define animals by how well they lie, cheat, and steal and deceive and manipulate each other as a mechanism for the evolution of intelligence, that might be correct in primates, but it's a deeply cynical view in a lot of other species that don't focus necessarily on lying, cheating, stealing, and deceiving. And so I wanted to take a step back from that and say, okay, what is a simpler explanation, one that is more universal and applies to more variety of species? So I did an analysis looking at what we know about long-term memory in animals, especially memory for other individuals, because I saw that as a relevant social test. A lot of times people ask me, what's the smartest animal? And I say, what are you asking them to do? If you're asking the animal to climb trees, then, there are a lot of animals that are really smart and very few of them that live in water are going to do well. So it really depends on what you're asking animals to do. So I wanted to find something that I thought, okay, if we're testing the social intelligence hypothesis, one way to come up with a semi-fair test of intelligence is to ask everyone how well they can remember other individuals. And I want you to look at this for a trend. One of the things that humans can do, and a lot of other animals that we consider quote unquote intelligent can do, is they can remember their kin and their non-kin fairly well. Okay. So if I say, okay, picture your mother, you can do that. If I say, picture your best friend in your head, you can do that as well. Now, some animals really can't do that. They can only really remember kin and non-kin. And really, it's kind of cheating because they're not actually remembering anybody. What they're really doing is they sniff themselves and then they sniff everybody else around them. And if everybody else around them smells like they do, that's my kin. And so it's kind of cheating. It's not really remembering an individual in your head. And so what I did is I looked at it and said, okay, if you have this fission fusion social system, the most complex social system there is, it's the kind we have, it's the kind a lot of species have, do you remember just your kin, or can you remember kin and non-kin? And it turns out where you see yes, you see a no for the most part. That means that if you have the complex social system, you can remember kin and non-kin. Okay. The only exception to that really is this weird situation here where we have an Asian elephant that remembered its mother, but it was an anecdote. He remembered his mother after about 15 years. And it was only really done with one animal. So if we were to test this more thoroughly, we would see that this also holds the same pattern that we've seen before. So that's the thing I was interested in. Can you remember kin and non-kin, and what kind of social system you have? And this sets up a lot simpler question. What if just keeping track of all the individuals you know in the world is the driver of intelligence in evolutionary terms? Meaning, just keeping track of everybody without a Facebook account to tell you who you're friends with, maybe that's what drives some of the other cognitive skills that you have, like remembering where your keys are or remembering some of these procedural aspects of your life. Okay, so let's talk about bottlenose dolphins. They are the star of this talk. Now, dolphins, although this study needs to be redone at some point, the average lifespan we have is about 20 years in the wild. There's a lot of variation there depending on what population you're talking about. Now, in the population assessed here, which is Sarasota, maximum age for males was about 40 years and females was about 50 years. What's happening is there's a lot of attrition in the young. So a lot of the young don't make it past that first year. Okay, so dolphins have a pod size of about 15 individuals, but can aggregate into superpods or supergroup sizes of over 100 different individuals. Now, I'm using the word pod here, and I really shouldn't be. We technically, because these are fission fusion animals, we really should be using the word group. But just because people tend to recognize the word pod, I've left it in. But yeah. Now, how do dolphins associate in different groups? Well, it's a lot based on their reproductive or social status. So, kind of the cliques kind of hanging together, right? The popular dominant females with the popular dominant males. And that really does influence a lot of their aggregations. Of course, in some populations, you see kind of all male groups of these kind of teenage male kind of age cohort, which corral females. You see that in Shark Bay a lot. Now, one of the things my students will often ask me is who would win in a fight, dolphins or sharks? And we even had some sharks, I noticed in the chat, some shark fans. Well, the truth is, in a lot of cases, the defense of the dolphins in social groups is what protects them. So one-on-one, it's a more interesting match. But because dolphins don't really hang out alone, they usually do a pretty good number on sharks in terms of protecting themselves. Now, dolphins have a vocalization that is really interesting and really unique. It's called the signature whistle. Now, a signature whistle is an individually specific contact call given most frequently when the dolphin separates from its group. So, for example, if you separated out from a group, you might call out to people from your group, say, Mary, Mary, where are you, right? Well, if you're a dolphin, you usually will call out your own name. Jason, 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 and help the others to find where you are. And so in the development of a signature whistle, mothers will whistle to calves continuously, even just before birth, so that the calf knows which whistle they're supposed to go back to when they get separated from mom. It's like a acoustic leash for your kid. Now, it's the contour that's used for individual recognition because dolphins do not have voices. The deeper they go in the water, the higher the pitch of the vocalization they produce, therefore not giving them a reliable voice cue like we have. Therefore, they have to use the shape of the whistle as the signifier of identity. Now, when dolphins are developing their own signature whistle, what they like to do is take elements from dolphins who come in and hang out with the group for only about a day and then head out, because that way they can avoid the problem of every dolphin in a group being named Bob, right? So that's the trick to it. So they really try to find elements of dolphin whistles that are more rare to what they've heard before. And so let's hear some signature whistles. Hopefully this works. So this is our first dolphin here. Okay, I'll turn that up a little bit. Here's our second dolphin with a constant frequency component. This is Nolani. And finally, on the bottom here is their mom, Tipico. Okay, and so just so you get oriented to what a spectrogram looks like, this is going to be frequency along the y-axis, and along the x-axis is going to be time. And this is the shapes of the whistles that they end up producing as measured on a computer. Now, the question I'm interested in here is going to be, how does social ecology intersect with cognitive ability on these big evolutionary scales? Really, what is the evolutionary origin of human intelligence, or dolphin intelligence, or chimpanzee intelligence, or elephant intelligence? These are the types of questions we're interested in, right? And we're going to start measuring that in a comparative sense, but first by getting data from dolphins. How long can dolphins remember the whistles of other dolphins in their socially complex environment? And so to do this study, I worked with multiple facilities, basically playing telephone, recording one dolphin from one facility, getting that signature whistle, and then going to another facility and playing back that signature whistle, even if they hadn't seen that individual in 20 or more years. Now, what was really helpful here is I also was able to work with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution to gather multiple whistles of individuals from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, well before the study had been conducted, so that even, I was a little kid when these dolphins were whistling, and these recordings were made by Amy Samuels. So I was able to get some pretty old whistles to add to this repertoire. Overall, we had about 53 subjects for this study, and when you added in those extra whistles from Woods Hole, we had 72 for which we had acoustic samples. So this is a pretty large repertoire for a managed care study. Now, the animals' ages were about 1 month to about 46 years, with 40% being wild-born and about 60% born under human care. So this is a 5-year study that we did about 1,300 playbacks, testing 266 relationships, which was pretty comprehensive. And the way that you actually do this type of work with a dolphin is that when they're swimming in their pools, and of course they have the ability, they can swim away, they can swim out of the pool and go somewhere else if they don't want to play along. But I'll tell you, dolphins are pretty keen to play along with this. This is something that dolphins do pretty readily under human care. What they'll tend to do is they'll get themselves into a circle swim pattern around their central pool area. And when their head crosses this imaginary line where the underwater speaker is placed, we end up triggering the playback. Of course, our hands are hidden, so they don't know. They can't look at our hands to see when we're going to play it. We then look and see what the dolphin does. Do they loop over and investigate? Do they just give you a little head turn? Do they do nothing? And so doing nothing would be a level 0 response. If the dolphin gives you a little head turn, that's a level 1. If the dolphin heads over to the speaker and responds for less than 2 seconds, we call that a level 2. If the dolphin approaches and hangs out for longer than 2 seconds, that's a level 3. And if the dolphin ever makes forceful contact with a gate or starts speed swimming or doing something kind of really extreme, we would call that a level 4. And that only ever happened once. And it was informative because it told us that those two dolphins probably needed to live together, and they now do. So that's kind of an interesting way to assess dolphins' social preferences. All right, so this is a playback, and so hopefully the acoustics are going to work. They may not, but the first sound you're going to hear is me triggering a playback. Everything else is the dolphin's own vocalizations in response to hearing this familiar whistle. Okay, and that goes on for some time. So that's a dominant male, and they're hearing the call of a dominant male, and so they're kind of investigating this. Like, ooh, they know this whistle. The whistle's only 5 years separated from them, so they are responding to that. All right, so how do you do this type of playback session? Well, the first thing you do is you play a whistle they don't know, and they may investigate that. You keep playing whistles they don't know until they get bored of that. Okay, this is what we call habituation. At some point, they're going to stop responding, and let's say they stopped responding at this dolphin. Now I'm going to play a familiar whistle. We'll see what they do. Then I'm going to play another unfamiliar, and again, I will keep playing unfamiliars until they stop responding. Let's say they don't respond to this one. I'll play another whistle, in this case, an unfamiliar whistle of a dolphin of the same age and sex as this dolphin, as the test dolphin. And the comparisons you're about to see are from familiar versus unfamiliar. Of course, we would switch the order of these around sometimes, so this would not always be the first thing they hear of this set. But that's how these data were basically derived. And the things I'm looking for are there sex effects? Are males or females better at remembering the whistles of other dolphins than the other sex? Age, is there age-related decline in memory, for example? Kin or non-kin, so again, testing whether or not you can remember your kin and your non-kin equally well. Time separated, I need to know basically is the amount of time they're separated have an effect on their memory. You would think that the longer they're separated, the less well they can remember those whistles. And how long they have to be together in order to form a memory. And so these are the main data. And what they're showing you here is that whether the dolphins are separated from 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 15 years, or 15 to 20 years, there is no drop-off in their ability to respond more to the black familiar bars than the white unfamiliar bars, which shows the longest memory ever seen outside of a non-human that is systematically tested. So that's multi-decade social recognition. In fact, when we did a model test on this, and because this interaction is non-significant, I can't tell you what the upper limit of a dolphin's social memory is. And in fact, we did do, after the study was published, a playback to a dolphin who had not heard Hastings in 40 years, and she tail slapped at the speaker, indicating that whatever he did 40 years ago, she's still holding some sort of grudge, maybe. Who knows? So that was a really interesting finding, and we did that in Hawaii. Okay, so here's what I've done now. I've taken the white bars and the black bars and just subtracted out the difference between them. So now I've just got this essentially on one bar, so to speak. So this is really the response difference, okay? So take the familiar response and subtract the unfamiliar response. And if the number of years that the animals were housed together made a difference here, all of these dots would fall into this box. They don't. They're pretty all distributed in this area here, meaning that dolphins can be housed together for short periods of time and still form super long-term memories. When we look at age differences, we see that the calves are less discriminating, and this kind of makes sense based on what I said earlier. Remember, younger dolphins are listening to whistles that they're hearing for the first time, and that'll kind of go away as a mechanism to create their own signature whistles. So the fact that calves are more interested in unfamiliar whistles, that actually kind of makes sense. Juveniles seem to be the least interested, with adults somewhat more interested here. Significant differences here between the unfamiliar responses between adults and calves, as well as juveniles and adults. So adults do spend kind of that middle amount of time paying attention to these things. Now, sex differences. There is a trending sex difference for males to be more responsive to unfamiliar signature whistles in their pools. And that kind of makes sense if you're thinking about territory defense, which males are more resource defense in that they defend against males getting their females. But generally speaking, that's not surprising either. The interaction, though, was non-significant. And this is what's really interesting. That goes back to that graph or that chart that I showed you earlier, showing that dolphins can remember kin and non-kin equally well. Although we are doing some work now to try to see if they are more interested in kin than non-kin, just as a matter of kin recognition. So that's stuff we're kind of working on these days. So in summary for this part, dolphins have very good memory for each other. And it's independent of how long they've lived together. There's some trending sex differences, and the calves are overall less discriminating. But both kin and non-kin are recognized. So what are the benefits of this? Well, helps you avoid antagonistic dolphins that you've had bad relationships with in the past. If you can hear their whistle a mile out, you know not to go near them. Also, if you hear a dolphin you like and you've had positive interactions with in the past, remembering that individual can be really helpful. Identifying mates, successful mates of the past. Kin recognition might be mediated through some of these memories. And as such, it may help with avoiding inbreeding if you can remember who your kin are. Okay, so I come out with this paper and I'm very, very excited because I say, okay, here's these dolphins with this really great memory. And everyone's like, oh yes, you showed really nice memory for whistles. What you didn't show necessarily was memory for individuals. And I was like, what do you mean? Well, dolphins are remembering the whistle. How do you know they're remembering the individual who owns the whistle? It's kind of like remembering a tune in your head, but not knowing the name of the song. It's like, oh, that ought to be hard to figure out. So we had to look into this idea about representational signaling. What does it mean for a name to be a part of you, right? And so for dolphins to be able to use long-term memory of signature whistles as a mechanism of identification, they need to pair it to an individual. They must be representational. And just to kind of highlight what I really mean here, are the dolphins remembering each other, or are they remembering the whistles? Okay, so I looked at some different studies that talked about representation. What does it mean for an animal to understand something representationally? And there was a paper in chickens that was really interesting about food calling. So if you give chickens food, they have a food call that they'll produce. Oh, there's food here, food, food, food. And if you give chickens food and you kind of play the sound of the food call after they've already eaten and they already know the food is there, they don't respond to it because they already know the food is there. It represents food. They know the food's there. Therefore, that information is less salient or less interesting. Well, that's good for chickens and food. What about what we're trying to get at? There was another study done in horses that looked at a cross-modal recognition of individual identity. Now, horses have voices, and horses can tell the voice of another horse. So they don't have individual contours or anything like that, but because they live in air, the voice works for them. So what do? Well, you take your horse, you lead it into a barn, and you have a playback speaker in the barn, and you play this call of a horse. Now, it could be the horse that you brought into the barn, or it could be a different horse. Now, if you play the call of the horse you brought into the barn, nobody bats an eye. None of the horses in the pasture care about that. However, if you play the call of a horse that wasn't brought into the barn, a mismatch, the horses care. And the horses respond and they look up. They're like, oh, wait, that's the wrong horse. Okay, so that's interesting, right? And that's a tool we could use. The only difference is I can't take dolphins around from place to place as easily as I could move a horse into a barn. So we're going to need to be creative here. How do we show representational understanding of signature whistles? Well, using cross-modal playbacks, but I can't use dolphins themselves. That's where the P part comes in. Okay. I had read a paper and a book by Ken Norris discussing some observations he had made that dolphins would swim through each other's excretia plumes, urine and feces, with their mouths open when they kind of slowly bow rowed in front of his boats. And I was like, well, what are they getting from that? Why are they doing that? That seems weird considering dolphins are known to be very, or at least assumed to have poor taste abilities and definitely can't smell anything. So we decided to test this. Then we went to Bermuda and we said, okay, let's figure out if dolphins have at least a urine cue that can identify they can use to identify each other individually. Because if this doesn't work, we're going to have to haul around a giant, huge, high-definition screen and put that into water, which will be very, very difficult. And so for my collaborators for this project were Professor Vincent Yannick, director of the Scottish Oceans Institute and my postdoc advisor at University of St. Andrews. And I also had some undergrads who worked with me on this, Paige Stevens and Samantha Shepard, who helped with this aspect of the project. All right, so two approaches here. One, we have to establish whether or not dolphins can identify each other through urine only. And to do that, we'll use familiar and unfamiliar urine. The second part is that cross-modal part. I'm now going to have to pair the urine with the signature whistle and see if they respond to it. So how do you get urine from a dolphin? Well, carefully. First thing you want to do is make sure that the dolphin has urine in its bladder, because it's very unpleasant to ask a dolphin for urine if it doesn't have any. That's not a fair thing to do for the poor dolphin. So if once you've assessed that they have a lot of urine there for you, you apply a little bit of pressure to the bladder. And when you do that, the dolphin will pretty soon get that as a signal to pee. And they do. And I collect. And when you collect enough of that urine, you're ready to go. At this point, we take that urine and we would put it at the end of these little cups here. The dolphins would be very easily trained to follow the urine around on this little cup. Surprisingly, the dolphins were very enthusiastic about tasting urine. And we could just keep going all day with this, and they were pretty ready to go. So this was pretty exciting to be able to do that. So you have someone kind of lead the dolphins along the dock area When they get near the speaker, you drop the urine, they taste the urine, we do the playbacks. Okay, that's for the cross-modal part. If we're going to do just the urine familiarity part, we just measure how long they keep their mouths open, tasting the urine of familiar versus unfamiliar urine, and we don't bother playing any sounds. All right, so those are the two studies here. And I'm going to play for you the first part here, which is just so you can see kind of how the cross-modal part worked. There's the playback. You may not be able to hear that just because of the audio. But he's looking. He heard it. Okay, that's his response to a mismatch. Let's see how he responds when we match the urine and the signature whistle. So that's him whistling. You can hear it. And he's still under there. Okay. So that's the cross-modal part. And so let's just take a look at, do the dolphins tell urine separately from water? And the answer is clearly yes. Yes, they do. With a mean response of about twice the amount of response for urine than for water, dolphins are definitely sampling urine more than they sample the water in terms of keeping their mouths open and tasting it. All right, so that tells us they can tell urine apart from water. What about familiar versus unfamiliar? That too is a huge difference. Unfamiliar urine only gets about 2 seconds on average of open mouth duration, whereas familiar urine on average gets about 7 seconds of open mouth duration. So they're really sampling familiar urine much longer than they are sampling unfamiliar urine, which is the same pattern we actually saw in the signature whistles. So they respond longer to familiar whistles than unfamiliar whistles. So that's great because that's indicating that dolphins can identify each other through urine cues. That's a big deal because dolphins would be the first ever vertebrate species able to identify another individual with a urine cue by taste. No other vertebrate can do that. And that's because dolphins don't have a sense of smell. They've lost their sense of smell over evolutionary time because their nose is their blowhole. And so as they lose their ability to kind of smell things, taste has kind of come in to do this kind of social recognition thing that you do see, chemical-based social recognition. You do see that in many mammals, most mammals, in fact. But dolphins have done it a completely different way, as dolphins do. All right, now that big question. Oh, actually, no, let me go back to this part. This is really cool. In some cases, and we had the hydrophones underwater when we were doing this, in some cases, we would present urine. No sounds, no playbacks, nothing like that yet. And the dolphins would whistle back to us, the signature whistles of the dolphins whose urine we just put in the water. They were labeling the urine we were giving them. So this is Dolphin 12 giving his own signature whistle, and this is one of our subjects whistling that signature whistle just after tasting the urine. That didn't just happen once, it happened twice. Here's signature whistle of Dolphin 16, and here is a labeling from our subject dolphin. So that's a pretty cool phenomenon. All right, so let's go back to that big question about whether or not dolphins can take the signature whistles and link them to the individuals who own them the way horses were linking voice to a horse when they were led into the barn. And what you see here is that when you look at how long the dolphins spend kind of hanging out at the speaker area, in a match versus a mismatch, they do the exact opposite thing that the horses do. They spend more time attending to matches than mismatches, which is what you saw in the video. Well, that's an interesting question, because why are they different than horses? Well, they're different than horses, but they're the same as us. When you do familiar and unfamiliar voices with children, you actually, in kind of these cross-modal experiments, if the voice matches a familiar face to an infant, they will attend to that longer than if it mismatches. So while dolphins are different than horses, which evolutionarily is interesting because they're more closely related to horses than they are to us, they act more like we do in terms of how they respond to these things. Furthermore, in acoustics, we find some interesting stuff in that dolphins respond more readily with acoustics to urine than they do water. And they respond more acoustically, here in this case, with echolocation for urine versus water. So that's also pretty interesting. That means that they're looking socially for something, or they're more interested in investigating. So age of urine does not significantly affect the duration of proximal response. The reason we were interested in that is because sometimes we had to freeze the urine in a -80 freezer. We didn't know if we were breaking whatever it is that they're using to identify each other. Turns out we weren't doing that. There seems to be no significant differences as a function of the urine donor's sex, which is good. And there seems to be no individual subject, I'm sorry, there are individual subject differences, but the key to this whole thing was we were worried that only the males could do this and not the females, because we think that this stems from the males having to need the ability to determine when the females are reproductively capable. And it turns out that both males and females can do this. So that's really exciting in the cross-modal work. Okay. Now, why is this stuff important? Well, first of all, as I said, dolphins are the first subjects known who can do gustatory-only social recognition. This provides a whole new thing in biology for us to study. Okay, and as such, bottlenose dolphins are really the first animals, as a function of this, to be able to use learned and individually specific contours the way we use names. They can use them in third dolphin references if that's what they choose to do. And when they're remembering those whistles over 20 years, they're remembering the individual who owns that whistle as well. Now, how could this be operating? Well, there's a couple of anatomy and physiology things with dolphins that are kind of unique. One, dolphins possess these unique muscular baskets in the kidneys, which may explain their ability to filter their urine to include compounds that are identifiable through taste receptors. Now, since we know that dolphins don't have the same level of advanced taste receptors most other mammals do, one of the things that we had to look for was their genetics around lipid taste receptors. And one of the things that you find, and this is very kind of early work that's being done here, we barely can study this in ourselves, much less dolphins. But the general idea is that we have lipid taste receptors that sit above our normal taste buds, and they process fatty acids as they come through. And people who don't have these CD36 lipid taste receptors often are obese or have a much higher propensity of obesity. So what could be interesting here, and we do know that dolphins do have these genes and they are used for lipid processing. What could be interesting is whether or not dolphins are using some form of steroid as a social identifier in their urine cues. And so that leads us to where we can go with this, which is determining what are the chemicals in their urine that they're using? That'll be very exciting to figure out. But the other thing is whether or not this can help us understand how lipid taste receptors operate so that we can better help people who do lack lipid CD36 genes in order to help facilitate a decrease in rates of obesity as a function of just figuring out how to replicate this or how to kind of provide this type of understanding. Because if dolphins have a CD36 taste receptor that's identifying individuals through this molecular means, then theirs is going to be a lot more robust to desiccation and study than ours is. The second you try to take our lipid taste receptors out, they fall apart. They're very tiny molecules. So hopefully dolphins can provide a better way of studying that post-mortem. All right, so I'm going to swing over to conservation now, kind of talk a little bit about that work that we've been doing. And this is kind of a different kind of thing. This is less about hypotheses and more about practicality and applied work. So some of you are, I'm sure, familiar. There's a lot of great work being done, especially in Sarasota, on health monitoring in those populations there. And they've had data from those animals for over 50 years. And a lot of times what that involves is taking animals and putting them on a boat. That's great if you can do it. Unfortunately, I live near an area where the dolphins aren't in such great shape. In the Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of animals that have been exposed to a lot of bad things, and this is more or less what our dolphins can look like sometimes. And these are the environments they tend to live in. A little less pristine, right? And if you were to try to do this with these kinds of guys, they wouldn't make it. So you need a way to assess their health in a passive way, all right, to avoid this kind of stuff. And so we need a way to measure hormone levels, generalized health data, parasite loads from animals in order to determine the amount of environmental stress that they're experiencing. Now, we do know that cortisol can be sampled from the mucus in cetacean blow breaths. We've seen that from work being done at Mystic Aquarium, as well as others using poles and collectors from poles. And we do know that at some level, mucus has been sampled using large drones, large UAVs. This is an Inspire 2 UAS kind of flying over this large whale. But the problem is dolphins are scutchy around these things. They can hear the UAS coming, the drone coming. They will dive under. You'll never see them again. And the breath is not 15, 20, 30, 40 feet in the air. It's significantly lower than that. So if dolphins are more reactive than large whales and they have a smaller breath field, the problem of collecting blow from them is much harder than it is from the big whales. So this is a hormone heist. How do we pull off a hormone heist? Well, you get the best in the business. And of course, my collaborators through much of this, Jamie Jacob, who I hope is here. I think he's here with us now. Haley O'Brien, who's helped with some of our imaging. Rick Gaeta, who has been out there with me many times in the field working with some of this stuff. And our modeling expert, Aaron Alexander, who's helped with a lot of these projects. We've also had a lot of graduate students who've worked with us in this. CJ Barton, Mitch Ford, Paige Stevens in my lab, Savannah in my lab, Alvin working with Dr. Jacob, as well as my graduate, MS graduate, Tabitha Gunners, who was big help in our visual work, which I'll show you here. We've also had a lot of undergraduates who've worked with us on many of these related projects, and so I want to give a shout out to them as well. All right, so the first thing I want to talk to you about is playbacks. So you've seen me do playbacks underwater. What about doing playbacks in the air? And we did that. We had microphones established kind of all the way through in the air, kind of moving down from a top speaker placement about 30, 40 feet up above the animals. And we looked to see how the sound was moving into the water and also how the animals respond to that sound. And what you see here is that we did a couple of common UAS types. The control tone was just the sound of a trainer's whistle. So something we didn't think would be too negatively responsive. And what's interesting here is that a fixed wing, which is an airplane-like drone, and the M600, which is a surprisingly large six rotary bladed UAS, do no different than a control tone in terms of the animal's diving response. So basically how long the animals stay submerged underwater after hearing the sound. The very common and commonly used DJI Phantom, however, gets a lot of response. And that must mean because it's within their hearing frequencies, really well within their hearing frequencies. And so this very popular drone seems to be a very poor choice for a hormone collecting system. We also did some drone tests. This is work that Savannah was doing with us to kind of look at how the actual drones themselves garner different responses. And so here we have a mini, essentially an enterprise advanced system with a thermal camera. as well as our Inspire 2. And basically we had dolphins just, when do they start looking at the UAV? And these are the behaviors we would be looking for. So they're kind of rotating their body, looking up at the drones, turning their heads, looking up at the drones. And what you can see here is, as expected, the larger Inspire 2 does tend to get the most number of looks. Mini gets the least amount. Enterprise is kind of in the middle. So size here is a really good predictor of how well the animals are, or how much the animals are going to respond. With the height of the Inspire 2, if you look at that in more detail, height overall is not significant, which is interesting as you go across time. But if you just break out the Inspire 2, you do see a height effect. So as the drone approaches this kind of about 100 and let's say 160, 170 feet above the animals, they stop looking at it and start basically submerging. All right, so this will tell you exactly what that threshold amount is for how high you should fly that above the animals before you really start affecting their behavior. So that's been helpful data. Now, the other thing, if you're going to fly drones really close to an animal's blowhole, one of the things you're probably going to want to do is get a sense of their visual field. What can they see around their head? And so this is some training, and hopefully you can hear it. I'm going to turn the microphone to face it. What you're going to hear is the idea that when the light turns on, the dolphin's going to whistle. Now you're going to hear some whistles, which are the trainers basically saying the animal's good job not accidentally responding too early. But hopefully if you see the little light kind of reflected on his head here, you should be able to kind of hear that he whistles himself.
Yeah, you're doing a great job. Nice one, Coop. Good boy.
There it goes.
Yay, good job. Nice one, buddy. Good boy. Good.
All right. So these guys were trained to whistle when a little light turned on, and we put little lights all around their head in this dome. And the idea was, if they can't see the light, they won't whistle. And it'll allow us to generate a map of their visual field. And that's what this is. Whoop, go back. Almost. There it goes. Okay, so this is the visual field for one of the dolphins in the study. And as you can see, thankfully, there is a nice blind spot right behind the dolphin's blowhole, right where the plume would aggregate if they were moving at some speed. So it won't go straight up if they breathe. It'll go a little bit back. And thankfully, there is a blind spot back there that we can use to collect some hormones. Now, of course, one of the other aspects of this is RoboDolphin, or we call it the Chuff Sim. And this is work CJ Barton and Rick Gaeta, Jamie, Jacob, everybody kind of working really hard on developing this. The idea is, okay, if we're going to be either in Oklahoma or Texas or kind of developing this, we want to make sure that this is safe to use before we actually put it near dolphins. And so the idea is to kind of do a hormone heist in practice, right? Can you build the fake safe so you can practice cracking it? If you're talking about Ocean's 11, that's what we're doing here, right? And so you have to build a dolphin lung system. And that's what this is. And so we're trying to simulate the actual dolphin's breath. And this is me kind of getting blown with snot in my face here at about 10 feet above the dolphin's head. And when I was done with this, I had basically dolphin boogers all over my glasses. So we just need to be able to replicate this with our RoboDolphin. And this here is some work in particle image velocimetry, where you're basically determining the speed and direction of all the particles emanating from the blowholes. This is that high-speed photography. And so if we look at this kind of system, basically the way it works is this kind of pumps in, and this very large set of canisters blows air through at a rate of about a 0.3 second chuff with the same velocity that you would expect from a real thing. Here's the system in action. And there you go. You can see how it pumps through there. Now, what you may be noticing here is that that doesn't look very dolphin-like from that point on. Okay, and we even had kind of a nozzle on it, and we were getting pretty interesting data from that. But you really do need to replicate the nasal passage of an actual dolphin. And to do that, this is work that Haley O'Brien helped us out with her micro CT scanning system, which is the highest resolution CT scan ever conducted on a dolphin, period. This is to the width of a human hair. So we have a really good sense of what their nasal system looks like. This was a dolphin that passed away out of Oklahoma City Zoo. We were able to take that and extrapolate out the nasal passage and essentially kind of build that out into a 3D representation. And once we had that 3D representation, we could, of course, 3D print that, which is what the folks at USRI did. And they took it basically modifications of that scan and built essentially the flange that plugs into that. And now you actually have a dolphin's respiratory system built on top of your RoboDolphin. And that's basically what the 3D print looks like. And that has allowed us to basically assess at this point what kinds of UAVs have any shot of collecting hormone samples from our Chuff Sim. Now, what's interesting here is, as you can see, this rotary UAV is blowing all of that snot away. So it really tells you that that type of system is not the best system for helping to analyze blow samples. So something like a fixed wing system or a hybrid fixed wing VTOL system might be the better approach, allowing you to collect the samples that you need. The other thing that's been great, and this is work from Aaron Alexander, is to really highlight how you can model all the different ways the particles will move based on wind speed and velocity of the animal. So it's really giving us a better shot of collecting the blow than just flinging a drone at the dolphin's blowhole and hoping for the best. So we're going to be beginning our ground and lake tests. Our trained dolphin tests are, fingers crossed, in March, and then we'll be sampling hopefully in Galveston fairly soon. So I'm going to leave you with Stephen Colbert making fun of my work.
Marine biologists have discovered that dolphins recognize each other by tasting one another's urine. Yuck. Also, what are dolphin high school reunions like? Oh my goodness, Dan Noonan? Honey, it's Dan Noonan. Come over. No, it is him. Give her a taste. See? It's Dan. He looks great.
Now I can say I participated in the cultural zeitgeist. So with that, I want to thank the European Union for funding for a lot of this work. Thank Dolphin Quest Conservation Grant, Oklahoma University's Unmanned Systems Research Institute's funds for a lot of the work done here, Woodrow Wilson Foundation, University of Chicago's Guiano Fellowship, and thank my grad students and my lab for all their support. And with that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Hello, sorry for that delay while I clicked a million buttons. Thank you so much. For folks who are new to DCP webinars, if you enjoyed this listen, whether it was live or recorded, you can get more of them on our website. Just look under the Knowledge Hub, you'll find webinars. You can also find them directly on our YouTube channel. And then if you have watched them all and you need more, make sure that you listen to our podcast, The Dolphin Pod. And this webinar was a deep dive, so fairly technical. Hope you enjoyed it. Google some words, some terms. And then we also have dolphin lessons that are geared more towards kids and the young at heart. So check all those out. And we are appreciative for everyone who listens, who stays in touch, who follows along. And we would be a poor well, we are, we would be a bad nonprofit if we didn't remind you how you can support our work, become a member, check out our new online store, join us in the field. If you shop on Amazon, even if you don't choose DCP, make sure you're choosing a nonprofit and starting at Amazon Smile and get some of that money over to organizations that need it. And then stay in touch. So with that, we're going to get to some questions. We don't have a lot of time. So we have a couple, just congrats on the great talk and how far the research has come. I think I'll start maybe with the two general questions and then loop in the more specific questions. So one general question we got is, can dolphins swim backwards?
That's an interesting question. So in terms of their kind of movement, sometimes you'll see them move their pecs a little bit like this and kind of scoot their way back a little bit. I've seen them do that. But I think it's fair to say they're kind of forward oriented. They're kind of a missile shaped animal kind of heading in a direction there.
Yeah. And as you can imagine, at the Dolphin Communication Project, we get this question a lot, but I'm going to put it in your lap this evening. Do you think there will ever be true two-way communication between dolphins and humans? I'm going to take that to mean that it's not the general, like, I know when a dolphin is, saying back off. There is some communication. I think this person is talking about conversation.
Yeah, and I think it depends on what definitions matter completely in this. Will you ever have the same type of conversation with a dolphin that you have with another human being? That has to assume that the dolphin thinks like you do. And the animal is under no obligation to think the way we do. They think their way. And while we are absolutely capable of sharing information back and forth from dolphin to human easily, one of the things that we will always struggle with is having that one-for-one communication between human and dolphin, because again, no animal thinks like we do. That being said, when a dolphin whistles another dolphin's signature whistle, that's interesting. Are they naming that individual? Is that a third dolphin reference? I think that's kind of exciting. I think there's a lot of potential there. I've done playbacks with dolphins where I whistled like a subadult male, and then all of a sudden the dolphins came back up to the speaker and whistled all the dominant males as a like third dolphin reference. And so right down the list of the most dominant, the individual we knew to be the biggest and most dominant, and goes right down the list, down like 3 or 4 individuals. And at that point, you get a sense like, okay, maybe I think I have a sense of what I'm not a DJ. This isn't a request line. So that's interesting, right? I've had dolphins, when you play one dolphin's whistle, they whistle the kin of another dolphin that's related to the one you played. And so that's where you start getting some really interesting kind of stuff. Whether, again, does that translate into nouns and verbs and adjectives? Probably not, but it does translate into getting a sense from their communications point of view, some level of external referent, because they can refer to each other. And so that is interesting.
Thank you. Did you have quality issues with the archived recordings from Woods Hole?
Now, so the way, and this is kind of in the woods a little bit for those who are into acoustics, so use like audiophiles will love this part. When you're working with acoustics, they're basically based into sampling frequencies. And sampling frequency is just the way that the computer samples aspects of the sound wave through its progression. And if you ever play like an MP3, it's really kind of chopped up version of the sound. That's why some people really prefer to listen to records, because records are a true analog recording, right? The thing about those recordings from Woods Hole is they were recorded onto VHS cassettes. like just the audio part on these things that used to be where you put your like Disney video cassette, you used to watch Little Mermaid on the VHS, except this just had audio on it. And so they were very high resolution. They were basically analog as it was. And so the digitization of those recordings actually worked pretty well as long as the digitizer had a high enough sampling frequency. And then, of course, the playback speakers limited to about 20 kilohertz on the upper end, which is about the highest level of great hearing you can expect from the best human hearers. So that's always that limiting factor on all the whistles. So any whistle that goes above 20 kilohertz is not a great candidate for playback. So all said and done, no, the acoustic quality kind of equalized out that way. And so we were good to go.
Very cool. I liked this question. When you and your team proposed the urine component of the study, how was that received at the facilities? Did they think you were joking, or were they excited right from the get-go?
Well, okay, this is Dolphin Quest. We love Dolphin Quest. Dolphin Quest is the best. They've worked with us for so many years, and I think there's a trust factor here, right? I have worked with them for a long time, so I can say, "Hey guys, I got this idea. Here's the foundation for it. This is where it comes from, and we're just going to try it and just see what happens." And then after the first one or two goes, these dolphins are lining up ready to go again. So at that point, you're just like, "Hey guys, I've even found a new form of enrichment that you can try." Because they're so like, this is something that they just line up ready to do. We could do 20 sessions in a day and they wouldn't get tired of doing this. It's one of those enriching things. So yeah, initially there's always like, what do you want to do exactly? And then it's like, here it comes from a place of somebody saw this and there's a
Sound
reason.
scientific curiosity.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Excellent. Switching gears to the drones, do you the response data? Sorry, let me look at the question I jotted down as it came down. The drone reaction results. Do you think that as drones become more popular and accessible, is that will those types of results get out to recreational boaters, filmmakers to perhaps influence their drone choices?
That's an interesting question. And so if you're looking at it, I think part of their drone choices are, and that's why we tested that Inspire 2. That Inspire 2 has a lens on it that they use to film movies with, right? And so your nature documentaries that are done by Netflix and BBC and all those, they will use those Inspire 2s with that high-end lens recording in 8K to hard drives built into the drone. And so their usage is really determinant on the quality of the footage they want to get, right? So that's their number one, their number one consideration is, well, this has got to be played on people's 8K television sets too. So we're going to need to use this is the only drone really that does that isn't custom built. And so that's part of their decision making. What we can help them with is saying, if you don't want to have footage of a dolphin that has dived away from you and scooted off, stay above 170 feet and basically put a telephoto on that and go from there. That's the thing that we can contribute to at least the filmmaking end of things. I think from the researcher point of view, this has been we've been one of the research labs in the game of figuring out how to best use this technology, because it's been so important. The additions we've had with biologging, with putting like tags on cetaceans, using drones, we're starting to close the gap between what we understand in dolphins and whales and what we would understand in a lot of terrestrial mammals that are easier to see because they're not underwater and in the middle of the ocean. So, that's really exciting because, we'll be able to learn. This is a renaissance in data for finding new things. The problem is going to be that nobody has started really using everything yet. And so we're having to kind of, somebody's got to test this stuff out and see, okay, this is the best thing for this, and this is the best thing for that. And that's where working with animals under human care really helps, because you can ground truth a lot of this stuff. before you buy expensive things and send it out into the field and hope for the best. So, yeah.
That segues to a question. I don't know if it's specific enough for you to speak to it in a 20-second soundbite. But did you find any differences in the behavior and responses between wild dolphins and dolphins in human care? But I think there hasn't been that comparison yet. Correct?
Right. We have not, with the systems that we're using, we have not brought this out to the wild yet. Again, everything is baby steps with what we're trying to do. We're really trying to build it from managed care and then do our managed care tests. Once we have those data kind of in place, then we go to the regulation boards of NOAA and the Marine Mammal Commission and say, this is what we want to do. This is our qualifications to do that. And this is where we want to see that. And then at that point, once we've kind of shown how the system operates, we hope to attract a lot of other researchers who are working in these questions, but don't necessarily have these solutions figured out for themselves yet, and say, hey, we can provide this for you as a choice for your research as an option. So really, we're still nascent, I guess is the best word, in where we're getting with this, but we're moving forward.
But it's very cool. I mean, you put in your bio that, it was conservation technology development. And I think that's like, bold neon sign, really, really cool stuff there. I think I'm going to wrap up. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but I'm not going to be able to post it if it gets much longer.
Sure.
So I'm not playing any favorites. I'm just picking the last question. Do dolphins recognize their trainers to the same degree, I guess, or to the individual like they do each other? How do they differentiate people since we don't have signature whistles?
That is an interesting question. We've gotten, we've looked at that many times. Anecdotally, of course, I think anybody who's worked with these animals for any period of time would say, yes, these animals have, I've went away for 5 years, came back, and they, jumped out of the pool to hug me, that kind of thing. And I've seen it. I've watched it actually happen to friends of mine who did see animals they hadn't seen for a while, and they just kind of, hello. So anecdotally, absolutely. Has it been systematically studied? Not to my knowledge. And that's asking dolphins to do facial recognition. And we don't have a great handle yet on a lot of their social, facial, visual recognition systems yet. Not saying they can't do it, and not saying even, our voices are pretty reliable for them, and maybe they do use our voices. And that could be an aspect as well. But that's a great area of study. That's a great option to look at.
And a good reminder, as DCP is part of why we're doing these talks, is so that we can kind of add our little contribution to upping the scientific literacy in the general population. So it's not just scientists talking to each other all of the time. And that's a great point, that there are really amazing questions that are being asked. It doesn't mean we know how to ask them yet, how to gather the data. So that's awesome. And I will say you have some inquiries about how people can join your research. So I'm guessing that's on your website. They can kind of track you down if they're looking to apply to school or graduate school or something like that, and find you.
Sounds good. Yeah, that's right. And my email is out there. So just go ahead and Google me and you'll find me. All righty.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everyone who joined live. Thank you to everyone who's listening to this recording whenever and wherever that may be. And with that, I wish everyone a good night, and thanks again.